Hello and welcome to It's a Code U, mental health support for those working in healthcare. This is a podcast created for healthcare employees to explore not only issues relating to mental and emotional health, but also unique challenges that those working in healthcare are faced with. Your hosts are Adina Tucker, a licensed clinical social worker with Dartmouth Health, and Jennifer Hinsey, an MSW also with Dartmouth Health. Hello, and welcome to It's a Code U. And today we are diving into a topic that is close to both of your hosts' social work hearts, and I believe is really essential for all of us in healthcare, which is a holistic approach to mental health. We'll explore what holistic really means in the context of mental health, and we'll dig into the interplay between biology, psychology, and the social world, including the impact of systemic forces like racism, housing instability, and political stress, and offer examples of how we can bring that perspective into the care that we provide. So let's go ahead and begin.
Well, I will begin talking about when I was a freshly minted second year grad student pursuing my social work degree. I still remember one of my very first days shadowing my field placement supervisor, who was a hospice social worker. And one of our first clients together was a lady who I'll call Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson was a soft spoken woman. She was in her early 70s, and she had recently been admitted to hospice after a very long cancer journey. And her vitals were stable. Her pain seemed to be managed well. And so, by all accounts, observations, and all the medical reporting that comes with being on hospice, her clinical team thought this was a good hospice patient, right? A good situation, stable, not one to worry about too much. But I will say, when we went in for that first visit with her, something in the room definitely felt a bit unsettled. When we asked how Mrs. Wilson was feeling, she hesitated and then she said, "I don't know how to die. I've always been the one holding things together." And if you can imagine this scene, her husband was sitting in the corner. He was quiet, kind of pale. He kept his eyes on the floor most of the time. She did have an adult daughter who was just pacing back and forth, checking her phone. And there was a lot of tension in the room. It felt very thick with fear, but no one was really naming it or talking about it. Now, my field supervisor, she didn't jump immediately into paperwork. She didn't talk prognosis. She didn't get into some of the more immediate clinical things that you might expect to be discussed. But instead, she sat down beside the bed and she gently said to Miss Wilson, "Tell me about the roles you've played in your family and what's the hardest about letting them go." And that question, just that single question, really opened a floodgate. Mrs. Wilson shared all these stories of caretaking, her own personal story of immigration, of teaching piano lessons to generations of kids in her community, basically an entire lifetime of holding strong for others. And in that moment, it became pretty clear that this wasn't about just symptoms or pain management. It was about identity and family dynamics, grief, spirituality, the things that medicine alone really can't always hold. And that moment taught me something that I try to carry into every client interaction I have now as a social worker, that a person's mental health and well-being can't be separated from the world they live in. Their relationships, their history, their cultural context, their fears and their strengths. And that's the heartbeat of social work, the person and environment perspective. And it's what we're talking about here today.
So let's talk about, what does holistic really mean? The word holistic gets tossed around a lot, but when we break it down, especially in the healthcare context, it means attending to the biological or physical level, the psychological or mental level, and the social or relational level, also known as the biopsychosocial model. The word holistic is derived from the term holism, which refers to the theory that all parts of a whole are intimately interconnected. Holism is a concept whose name originates from the Greek word holo, meaning whole, and asserts that focusing on individual elements or even multiple elements in isolation prevents a complete understanding of how they function as a unified system. When applied to healthcare, this principle emphasizes caring for the person in their entirety rather than merely addressing physical signs of illness or injury. And in 1946, the World Health Organization affirmed this characterization of health as an all encompassing condition of physical, mental, and social well being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity when they adopted their constitution. Although this definition has been in use since its publication by the WHO, it was not universally accepted from the start. Over the course of history, people's understanding of health has undergone continual change, ultimately shaping the more comprehensive perspective that we hold today. This implies that truly optimal health exists only when these three interconnected spheres, biological or physical, psychological or mental, and social or relational, are all thriving. So, the biopsychosocial model is foundational in both medicine and mental health. But social work adds something more. We tend to zoom out. We ask, how is this person situated within systems? So we recognize that structural issues like racism, poverty, or lack of housing aren't outside the clinical picture. They are actually in the room with us. So practicing patient care through the lens of person and environment is a cornerstone of social work. We don't just treat a patient, we treat the whole person in the context of their biology, their psychology, their relationships, their environment, systemic inequalities and inequities, and yes, the whole world around them. This comprehensive perspective allows social workers to address the root causes of mental health issues.
So now let's look at each domain and how they interconnect. First, we're going to talk about the biological psychological connection. And to kick this off, we are going to talk about a patient who we'll call Mr. Robinson, a real patient composite that I think many of us could recognize. So, Mr. Robinson's in his mid 50s and he's living with type 2 diabetes. He's been in and out of the ER 3 times this month. His blood sugars are all over the place, his A1C is high, and the medical team working with him is frustrated. Their clinical notes use words like non-compliant, disengaged, resistant to education. And this is where a holistic biopsychosocial framework approaching him through that whole person's lens of person and environment that Adina mentioned really can become vital to helping him. When we do that, we hear a different story. His wife died last year. He's been sleeping on his cousin's couch ever since. He used to love cooking, but now mostly eats fast food because it's cheap, quick, and always available. And he's tired all the time. His motivation is gone. He says, sometimes I don't care if the sugar gets me. From a biological standpoint, we know that poorly managed diabetes can cause fatigue, brain fog, even mood swings. But from a psychological lens, it's also clear that Mr. Robinson is depressed. And the social context, well, he's suffering profound grief. He is facing housing instability. He's isolated. The research confirms what we see in real life. The CDC has found that people with diabetes are 2 to 3 times more likely to have depression, but only 25 to 50% actually get diagnosed and treated. That's the kicker. Less than half ever get diagnosed, and even fewer receive treatment. So, how would we as social workers step into this space? Well, we start with curiosity over judgment, and we ask, what's getting in the way? Not, why aren't you doing what we told you? We do more for screen than depression. We explore how a patient's loss, identity, and resources are intersecting with their physical health. We notice patterns. Has this person lost someone recently? Are they living alone? Have they stopped doing things that they used to enjoy? We understand the systems. Maybe Mr. Robinson doesn't follow up with his primary care provider because the clinic is across town and he's been borrowing a friend's car just to get to this appointment. Maybe he never filled his prescription because he had to choose between insulin and rent. And when we know these things, we can become a bridge. We loop in behavioral health, we advocate for integrated care, and we help him get connected to a therapist who understands grief and chronic illness. We coordinate with a medical case manager to apply for a medication discount program. We connect with him in local support groups for men navigating loss, because depression often hides behind silence, especially for men who have been taught to just tough it out. We look beyond individual choices to structural barriers too. We shift the narrative from non compliant to under supported. Remember, holistic mental health only begins at the level of the individual, and it really shines at the intersection of these systems. We don't just treat the symptoms, we attend to the why behind the symptoms. And in a case like Mr. Robinson, when he begins to feel seen, when someone names his grief, when his insulin is affordable, when he's offered choices instead of judgments, everything starts to shift. He starts showing up. He starts asking questions. He begins to care again. And that's the power of holistic mental health care. Not more tasks on a treatment plan, but more meaning in the care that we provide.
So now let's talk about the psychological social interplay. Let's flip the lens. What about someone with anxiety who's showing up in the emergency department weekly with chest pain? Tests come back normal again and again, but no one's asked about their adverse child experiences, their relationship history, or current housing. Turns out this patient, we'll call her Michelle, grew up witnessing repeated acts of domestic violence between her mother and father. Her mother turned towards illicit substances to cope with the constant physical and emotional pain inflicted on her by Michelle's father. When Michelle was 13 years old, she was removed from the home and placed into the foster care system. She was one of the lucky few who was able to remain with the same stable, nurturing foster family until she was 18 years old and entered college, where she met her current husband, Roy. Soon after they married, the patterns of control and domestic violence that were all too familiar to Michelle in childhood began, and she found herself in the same position that she witnessed her mother when she was growing up. 5 years later, Michelle has finally escaped Roy and is now currently living in a shelter where violence is also common. Michelle doesn't sleep. She is hypervigilant. That racing heart, that shortness of breath, her body is responding to a real threat in her environment and to a lifetime of repeated exposure to threats. The psychologist Bessel van der Kolk authored a book on and writes The Body Keeps Score, meaning that trauma doesn't just affect the mind, but also the body, leading to physical manifestations and long-term physiological changes. Chronic stress, especially from the unsafe living conditions, exposure to violence, racism, or trauma, alters our nervous system, and it shows up in our clinics, our floors, our intake notes. But without that holistic approach to the patient before us, those integral parts of a patient's whole condition can get lost in those notes or become tragically lengthy, forgotten history. So, how do we help? We connect with case management, we advocate for trauma informed care, and we validate that these symptoms make sense given the context, and we don't pathologize what's protective.
Now let's talk about the social political context. So there's the literal and metaphorical air we all breathe, the quality and health of our landscape, our environment, the food and nutrition we have access to, and the social and political climate that shapes access, stigma, and identity. Perhaps those of you listening now were working in healthcare during the height of COVID, or you know someone who was. Maybe you were the nurse breaking down in the hallway, grieving the loss of yet another patient. But beneath that grief was rage. Grief and rage for the patients who didn't have to die, for the misinformation, the racial disparities in outcomes. And 5 years later, it still feels like it was all just yesterday. But for now, you still have to show up to work in the same functional capacity as always and carry on.
Or perhaps you're someone who has dedicated decades of your career to medical research, and your life's work has been a pursuit to heal others through innovation. And at present, you're facing senseless job loss as a result of executive orders. You're anxious, you're confused, and are feeling completely powerless. You're feeling pressured to look for another job, but where, how, and when? Everything is changing so fast with little time to plan your next move, which will possibly be a completely different career altogether. But for now, you still have to show up to work in the same functional capacity as always and carry on. Or perhaps in your day job, you're a primary care provider and you're a trans member of the LGBTQ plus community. For the past several years, you've also used your medical expertise serving our nation in the military reserves. And yet now you're facing the real threat that you may no longer be able to access your trans affirming care or provide that to your own patients. Yet another hardship compounding this is that the years you've spent serving honorably alongside your brothers and sisters in arms, who you would literally give your life for, has recently been presidentially ordered to end because you are a trans service member. You've worked so hard your entire life through the crushing shame you've unjustly carried and internalized as a trans person, and yet the highest office in the land and some friends and family, coworkers, perfect strangers now, advocate for your erasure, your silence. In their eyes, you're no longer even fit to defend their freedom. You're shocked, you're scared, and you feel invisible, yet simultaneously highly visible for all the wrong reasons. But for now, you still have to show up to work in the same functional capacity as always and carry on.
Now, what these three depictions that we just mentioned remind us is that our systems don't exist in a vacuum. Policies, from reproductive rights to immigrant access to healthcare, they show up in our bodies, in our stress levels, in our moral injuries. And for our patients, it's no different. A holistic approach to mental health means that it's crucial for mental health providers to address and acknowledge political turmoil directly, rather than avoiding or being vague about it, because political events deeply impact mental health, especially for marginalized communities, activists, and those working in high stress fields that are integrally tied and impacted by changing political policies. Acknowledging political stress validates that their reactions, whether that's anxiety, anger, grief, exhaustion, are understandable and normal, especially important when many clients feel alone in their stress if they're surrounded by people who don't share their views or experiences.
So, what can we do? Social workers and those practicing through the person and environment perspective speak truth in interdisciplinary teams. We name systemic issues when they're relevant. It's forthrightly addressing political turmoil as not just an abstract issue. It has real consequences for people's safety, stability, and rights. It's understanding that avoiding or minimizing these issues can make clients feel unheard or dismissed. We advocate for and push back against narratives that individualize suffering because mental health is political. Laws and policies affect access to health care, community safety, and personal freedoms. And providers have an ethical obligation to acknowledge systemic factors contributing to distress rather than treating clients in a vacuum. And we care for each other because resistance is absolutely part of holistic care.
All right, so what does this mean for us as providers? Well, we're going to bring it back to you, the provider listening to this on your commute or during your one quiet moment in a day full of chaos. Yes, we are talking to you, the provider listening to this in your car, maybe after a long shift, maybe it's before you head into one. You spend hours tending to other people's needs, walking into rooms full of questions, holding space when oftentimes there are no answers. You are unquestionably part of this holistic web too. So, how's your nervous system doing today? Have you had water? A moment to just breathe? Have you been seen? Not just for your output, but for your humanity. We want to say this plainly that you are not broken. You're responding to an impossible system with a very human nervous system, and you deserve holistic care too. Holistic care through the lens we've discussed today isn't just something that we give, it's something that we also model. And that means allowing ourselves the same compassion that we offer our patients. In social work, we talk about use of self. That's the idea that we bring our full personhood into our work. But that also means our own biology, our own psychology, and our own social worlds are in the room with us. That's not a flaw, it's just a reality. So let's break that down. just like we did previously for our patients.
So let's talk about the biological. So, how's your sleep? Are you skipping meals on back to back shifts? Is your body carrying tension that you've come to accept as normal? Chronic stress, irregular schedules, and emotional labor all take a toll. We know this intellectually, but when was the last time you really checked in with your body without judgment? Simple practices like hydration, breath work, or even grounding your feet to the floor between patient rooms can re regulate your nervous system, not as a luxury, but as a necessity, as a form of resistance.
Now, the psychological. What stories are you telling yourself about your worth? Is there an inner critic whispering that if you were really good at your job, you wouldn't feel this tired or this overwhelmed? We've had sessions with nurses, administrative staff, residents who have cried not because of one bad day, but because they were holding years of accumulated grief. We talk a lot about burnout, but underneath that word is often moral injury. And that's the pain of being unable to provide the care someone deserves because the system you're working in won't let you. And so we need spaces for reflection, storytelling, therapy, for community, spaces where our pain isn't pathologized but understood in this greater context.
Let's talk about the social part. What support do you have? Are there colleagues that you can be real with, not just about patient care, but about the toll that it takes? And what about the bigger picture, the policies, the staffing ratios, the societal expectations that treat healthcare workers as endless wells of compassion? Holistic care for providers means naming these systems, not internalizing them. It means moving from what's wrong with me to what am I up against? And then, when we can, building pockets of solidarity, peer support groups, debriefs, advocacy, humor in the break room.
When we commit to this truly holistic approach for ourselves, which means, again, tending to our own bodies, our minds, and environments, we don't just prevent burnout. We are modeling something essential for our patients. We model that being human in this work is not a liability. It's actually the point. Remember, you don't have to be superhuman to be a good provider. You just have to be whole and committed to returning to wholeness again and again. Embodying that holistic approach to mental health and care, applying that person and environment lens, is a great way to do just that.
We've covered a lot in this episode today. So, in closing, we offer this reminder that holistic mental health care is not about doing more, it's about seeing more. Seeing the whole person, the whole story, the invisible threads that link body, mind, and world. And as we've said many times so far, as social workers, we carry the lens of person and environment. Thanks for being with us today in this reflection. And more importantly, thank you for showing up every day for your patients, your colleagues, and yourself. If you have any questions, feedback, or concerns, please reach out to us at dhbhs.media@hitchcock.org. And thank you so much for listening.